What if Garth's story was never really about Garth at all? What if his entire purpose in the Testaments is secretly tied to Agnes's future? Because, honestly, the more you look at the way the series frames Garth, the more it feels like he represents something much bigger than just another character inside Gilead's system. At first, Garth almost seems distant from the emotional center of the story. Compared to characters like Agnes, Daisy, or Aunt Lydia, he does not immediately feel like someone carrying the emotional weight of the narrative. But that may be exactly why his role matters so much. Because the Testaments constantly hides major ideas inside quieter characters. And Garth may secretly represent one of the most important themes in the entire story: the difference between surviving inside Gilead and truly being free from it emotionally. That distinction matters enormously. Because one of the darkest truths about Gilead is that escape is not always physical. Sometimes people remain psychologically trapped long after they understand the system is broken. And honestly, I think Garth's storyline may become the key to whether Agnes ever truly escapes that psychological prison herself. One of the most fascinating things about Garth is how differently he views Gilead compared to many characters raised entirely inside its structure. There is emotional distance in him, observation, hesitation. He does not always react to the system with automatic acceptance the way others often do. That matters. Because in Gilead, unquestioning acceptance is survival currency. People are trained to normalize control so completely that they stop seeing it clearly anymore. But characters like Garth create emotional contrast. They remind viewers that the system is not natural, it is constructed, and anything constructed can eventually collapse. That may be why Garth's presence around Agnes feels so important psychologically, because Agnes has spent most of her life inside carefully controlled narratives about morality, obedience, and female purpose. Gilead shaped her understanding of the world before she was old enough to question it independently. But Garth represents something dangerous to systems like Gilead: perspective. And perspective changes people slowly. Not always through dramatic rebellion, sometimes through quiet, emotional realization. A conversation, a reaction, a moment where someone sees the system differently for the first time. And honestly, Agnes increasingly feels like somebody standing on the edge of exactly that transformation. One hidden detail in the Testaments is how often Agnes internally struggles between inherited belief and personal instinct. She wants stability, safety, meaning, but she also increasingly senses the emotional suffocation underneath Gilead's structure. That contradiction creates internal tension constantly, and Garth may unknowingly become the person forcing that tension into the open more clearly. Because people raised inside authoritarian systems often need emotional mirrors before they fully recognize their own imprisonment. They need somebody who reacts differently, questions differently, it feels differently. And Garth may quietly serve exactly that role for Agnes. Not by openly trying to save her, but by making her see that other ways of thinking still exist. That possibility alone is dangerous in Gilead. Because authoritarian systems survive partly by convincing people there are no alternatives. The system becomes emotionally inevitable, permanent, unquestionable. But once somebody begins imagining different emotional possibilities, the structure starts losing psychological control over them. And honestly, Agnes may already be beginning that process. That is why Garth's fate matters so much. Because if Garth represents Agnes's growing awareness of freedom emotionally, then what happens to him could directly shape what Agnes becomes moving forward. One terrifying possibility is that Gilead may recognize Garth's influence before Agnes fully understands it herself. And systems like Gilead fear influence more than rebellion sometimes. Rebellion is visible. Influence spreads quietly. That is much harder to control. Especially emotional influence. Because once doubt spreads internally, obedience becomes unstable. And Garth may unintentionally be planting exactly that kind of instability inside Agnes already. One of the saddest possibilities is that Garth himself may not fully realize the impact he has on her. Often in stories like the Testaments, characters become emotionally transformative simply by behaving differently from the world surrounding them. A different tone, a different perspective, a different way of seeing humanity. And for somebody like Agnes, raised inside fear, ritual, and ideological pressure, even small emotional differences can feel revolutionary internally. That may ultimately be why Garth's story feels so important beneath the surface. Not because he is destined to overthrow Gilead politically, but because he may help Agnes emotionally separate herself from Gilead's worldview for the first time. And honestly, that kind of freedom is where real resistance usually begins. Not with violence, not with revolution, with emotional clarity, with somebody realizing the system around them is not morally inevitable anymore. That realization changes people permanently. Another fascinating detail is how Garth's storyline may parallel Agnes's internal conflict directly. He increasingly feels like somebody navigating the tension between survival and authenticity. And that tension mirrors Agnes perfectly. Both characters exist inside systems demanding emotional conformity. Both are trying to understand who they really are underneath the roles assigned to them. And both may eventually face the same terrifying question. How much of yourself can you preserve while surviving inside Gilead? That question sits underneath almost every major relationship in the Testaments. Because Gilead does not only control actions, it reshapes identity. And characters who begin reclaiming identity emotionally become threats automatically. That may explain why Garth's future feels so emotionally dangerous. If he continues influencing Agnes's perspective, then he does not just threaten her obedience. He threatens Gilead's ownership over her identity itself. And honestly, I think Aunt Lydia may eventually recognize that before anyone else. Because Lydia understands psychological shifts extremely well. She notices emotional distance, doubt, internal rebellion before it becomes external behavior, which means Garth's connection to Agnes may eventually place both of them in danger, not because they openly rebel, but because emotional awakening itself becomes threatening inside authoritarian systems. That may be the heartbreaking tragedy hiding underneath Garth's story. He may become the person who helps Agnes emotionally wake up, while also becoming the reason Gilead starts watching her more carefully. And honestly, that would fit perfectly with the themes of the Testaments. Because freedom inside Gilead is never simple. Awareness creates danger. Clarity creates risk. The moment somebody truly sees the system clearly, survival becomes more emotionally difficult than ignorance ever was. And Agnes increasingly feels like somebody approaching that point rapidly. One of the darkest possibilities is that Garth's eventual fate may directly determine whether Agnes fully breaks away from Gilead emotionally or retreats back into fear. Because moments of awakening inside oppressive systems are fragile. People often move backward emotionally after trauma, punishment, or loss. So if Garth suffers because of his influence on Agnes, the psychological consequences could become devastating for her. Would she blame Gilead or blame herself? That distinction could define her future entirely. Because authoritarian systems survive partly by convincing people resistance only creates suffering. They weaponize fear emotionally until people start policing their own thoughts internally. And Agnes may eventually face exactly that emotional crossroads. But honestly, I think the story is quietly hinting at something hopeful too. Because once somebody truly experiences emotional connection outside ideological control, it becomes very difficult to fully return to blind obedience afterward. And Garth may represent that irreversible shift for Agnes. The beginning of seeing herself as a person before a role, a human being before a function inside Gilead. That realization alone could eventually change everything. Which is why Garth's fate matters far beyond his individual storyline. He may secretly be the emotional key to Agnes's freedom entirely. Not because he physically rescues her, but because he helps her imagine freedom internally before she is capable of reaching it externally. And honestly, that may be the first real crack in Gilead's control over Agnes that the system cannot easily repair.